On December 14th, 2012, Adam Lanza, a mentally ill 20-year-old young man, entered Sandy Hook Elementary School and killed 26 innocent people. His horrific acts led to America rethinking and revising their policies and procedures to keep weapons out of the hands of criminals and the mentally ill. My goal today is to give you the pros and cons of universal background checks for any sale or transfer of a firearm. And my specific goal is to show you how the cons of universal background checks outweigh the pros, especially when concerning average American citizens. What universal background checks for any sale or transfer of a firearm means any sale of a firearm, whether through a legal vendor, as such as a gun store, or person-to-person sales, would be subject to a background check. The transfers is when the possession of the weapon changes from one person to another. So background checks sound like a good idea. They sound like a great idea. In fact, they're already law. Any weapon purchased from a legal vendor of firearms needs to run through an ATF background check before the sale of the firearm is complete. However, private sales, such as person-to-person, don't require a background check. Even though there are laws that say if you know the person to be a criminal or you know the person to not be able to own a firearm under the law, that you are subject to the same penalties as they are. The fact is, people aren't always what they appear to be. Just because that person appeared to be a good person and not a criminal type doesn't mean that they have any less desire to use that weapon that they are legally purchasing from you for illegal means. According to Stephen Passamano, a police officer with the Lyndhurst Police Department with 7 years experience, last year 68% of the deaths of police officers in the line of duty came from firearms. While this statistic doesn't say if these firearms were obtained legally or illegally, it can be said that universal background checks, especially on person-to-person private sales, would hopefully reduce these numbers of officers being killed in the line of duty. Universal background checks also are almost universally supported, including Second Amendment advocates. However, just because these background checks are already law doesn't mean they're as effective as they should be. Background checks, like I said, already law, and there are strict penalties for those who violate or circumvent the law to sell firearms to people who are legally not allowed to own them. However, these universal background checks would be performed by the FBI, and these background checks are more strict, and they have more of a chance of turning people who would normally be law-abiding citizens into felons. According to a personal interview with Police Officer Billy Capp of the Lyndhurst Police Department, these background checks are stricter, and they review your whole history, including before you were 18 years old. And now, these background checks can also preclude you from owning a firearm ever because of mistakes made when you were 18 years old. This doesn't mean violent crimes or robberies or any of the traditional crimes you would associate with people who own guns. This means that a person could have gotten a disorderly conduct ticket, and these new FBI background checks, because of their strict policies, would prevent these people from owning firearms. Another thing that these background checks would have a serious effect on is the transfer of firearms. In America, it is common practice to lend a person a gun, whether it be for a day of bird hunting that you lend a friend a shotgun, or if your daughter lives in a sketchy neighborhood that you lend her your pistol for self-defense. However, under the new laws of these universal background checks for sales and transfers, both of these behaviors would be considered illegal, and if caught, all the parties involved would become felons, preventing them from ever owning guns in the future, preventing them from voting in certain states. So these background checks for the transfer of any firearm will turn everyday citizens who are abiding by the laws into felons because there was not an FBI background check in support of them lending a shotgun for a day of bird hunting to a friend. As can be seen on the universal background checks and the 40% website, which is a fact-based website where they interviewed inmates, of the inmates convicted of a firearm offense, only 8% of them admitted that they had obtained their firearm through legal means. That means 92%, or the vast majority, had obtained their firearms through illegal means. So background checks only apply for the legal means of transfer and sale. Also, as can be seen on the universal background checks in the 40% website, that criminals openly admit to obtaining firearms through illegal means. This doesn't mean that they tricked someone into selling it to them. These weapons were stolen or transferred in illegal manners. And in police officer Billy Capps' 6 years on the force, the dozens of gun crimes he has investigated or been a part of, he said 0 people had obtained their weapons through illegal means or legal transfers of firearms. So of the dozens of cases he's encountered in his 6 years on the force, that not one of them was obtained through a legal means of buying a weapon through a vendor, or buying a weapon person-to-person sale, or borrowing it from a family member who had lent the weapon to them. Criminals had admitted to openly stealing these weapons, taking them from people that they didn't know, or taking them from relatives without their knowledge. Now, universal background checks, while useful in stopping criminals from obtaining firearms through legal means, they don't do anything to stop them from obtaining firearms through illegal means. Criminals break various laws in their commission of their crimes, whether it be robbery, murder, bringing a gun into a gun-free zone. So universal background checks would only be one other law that they would have to break, which criminals don't, as admitted, they don't mind doing. As a proponent of the Second Amendment, I am an advocate of psychological tests opposed to background checks, because a background check is only useful if a person has been convicted of a crime or has a record. For those people that intend on using a weapon for a crime and don't have a record, a universal background check would do very little to stop them from obtaining a firearm. So just because a person has a record doesn't mean that they intend on using a weapon for a crime. And just because a person doesn't have a record doesn't mean that they don't intend on using a weapon for a crime. So in my opinion, universal background checks will only turn law-abiding American citizens into felons and have little effect on the people that they are intended to target, which would be the criminals and the mentally ill.